Big buffs are coming in 10.2 for a lot of specs, and there are great changes, especially for healers, with buffs to Restoration Shaman for up to 30 and 40% on their healing, Holy Priest as well. Restoration Druid is getting its Flourish cooldown reduced, and even the Rogue, which has gone under a rework, is still getting tuning to make sure that all the spells function and perform properly with the upcoming Mythic Plus and Raid testing that's going to be live on the PTR. First of all, the name of the game, Restoration Shaman, is getting a buff to Riptide's initial heal by 30% and Unleash Life's healing increased by 40%. Riptide's healing being increased is very important because right now Riptide actually does very little healing. If you look at some of the top logs for Rashok, for Restor Shamans, which Rashok is a very, heal intensive boss in the raid, Riptide just is, I don't know, 5% of your overall healing, which is kind of concerning considering that the new tier set functions very closely with Riptide, specifically the 2-step bonus as well, which says Chain Heal, Healing Surge, and Healing Wave mark their initial target with Tidal Reservoir, kind of like a beacon for Holy Paladin, causing them to receive 15% of all Riptide healing you deal for 10 seconds. And obviously, if that Riptide healing is very poop, then that 15% is not going to be very important anyway. Obviously, only the initial healing of Riptide is increased, which is, the first step, because probably they don't want the ability to just go overboard, but it's definitely going to factor into the transfer of the healing. While on top of all of this, the 4-set bonus for Restoration Shaman also has Riptide's healing increased by 15%, obviously a little bit better after the baseline damage of the spell is increased by 30%, and if Riptide is active on the same target as Tidal Reservoir, its heal over time effect has a 10% chance to create a new Riptide on a nearby ally. Which is great because we can only assume the intended mechanic of this is to create a new Riptide by also factoring in the initial heal of the new Riptide that's going to once again be buffed, meaning that Riptide is essentially going to be better. Now, the numbers themselves are kind of relative since we haven't yet been able to test the raid in the Mythic Plus, which will be available soon this week and the following weeks as well. So we will see exactly where the numbers lie, but suffice to say that the changes will continue until the 10.2 will release, and we're going to also be looking at Priest at the same time, with Holy receiving a 40% buff to its heal spell, to the healing of heal. The new tier set doesn't really factor too much into the heal spell as well, unless you just use it to kind of, reduce the cooldown of your holy words. But currently, once again, if you look at some of the top holy priests that are just banking crazy healing numbers in the raid, heal isn't used almost at all, which is very concerning. Now, it could just be a build choice, but at the very least, if heal does more healing, then you can assume that more priests will be using it. And considering still that this is a staple of Holy Priest's toolkit, it's kind of weird not to use like a basic spell. So 40% is probably the first step into putting it back on the map. Continuing with the heal situation, we have to look at Restoration Druid as well. They're getting a buff to Flourish's cooldown, being reduced to 60 seconds down from a minute and a half. Which is good because, well, the dev notes essentially say we're increasing the availability of Flourish as its peak power level has gone down significantly. Which is weird because the current tier set of Restoration Druid ties heavily into Flourish, and even with the tier set making Flourish important, it's still not good enough. So that kind of talks a little bit as to how powerful this spell should be. So 60 seconds is a big buff. Obviously, having a 1-minute healing cooldown is very cool for healers. I mean, I've main healer, I know how important 1-minute cooldowns are, and it definitely helps Resto Druid as well, because healers in Dragonflight are suffering, and we will have a video in the near future. Sticking with the Druid, we have a core ability being addressed, and that is Heart of the Wild, which indirectly affects Resto Druid probably most out of all of the Druid specs. Heart of the Wild now additionally reduces the cast time of balance spells by 30% and increases their damage by 20%, which was 30% before. So the damage bonus is slightly reduced, but the cast time has been increased, and it generates 1 combo point per 2 seconds while in cat form and increases physical damage by 20%, which was prior by 30%. Obviously, this impacts Resto Druid the most because they are essentially the spec that could benefit from dealing damage as a healer more than anything else, Second comes probably Guardian when you are off tanking in raid, which is a very niche situation and happens for a very short amount of time. Otherwise, Heart of the Wild is just a big buff to restore Druid. Having faster cast times obviously works really well for a healer because you're not going to get stuck in the same place casting a lot of spells for a lot of time. Also plays way better into the Restoration Druid's playstyle of putting up HOTS, moving around, being all over the place, being mobile, and that's generally how Resto plays. We will touch on the Rogue because the Rogue did receive a rework and we're gonna have videos on it as well. Now, a lot of the changes for the Rogue is essentially to tune it down. Some abilities were a little bit too strong, but the majority will be buffed. First of all, generic Rogue talents, Night Stalker sees a damage bonus reduced to 5 and 10% down from 8 and 15%, and Elusiveness now causes evasion to reduce damage taken by 20%, which prior to this was 10%, meaning that this will essentially mean more damage reduction. Now, this is very interesting because Rogue also received a talent that gives you a second charge of Feint, and now Elusiveness also buffing evasion more and obviously making Feint really strong can give you a lot of damage reduction in raid and could potentially just make you not want to pick cheat death anymore, because Elusiveness is at a choice with cheat death, which is really good because I don't know if I've ever seen a rogue without cheat death in PvE. Further moving to Assassination, we have some tuning occurring with Venom Rush energy return reduced to 5, down from 6. A little bit of a nerf there with the energy economy since Assassination is kind of all over the place with energy right now. King's Bane damage is reduced by 10% because it was hitting a little bit too hard, with Eternal Bleeding damage reduced by 20%. And we have dev notes for a lot of these changes that confirm that they will be applied later on into the PTR testing cycle, so you won't see the results right away. But Exsanguinate has been addressed as well because Exsanguinate now has 2 abilities, 1 active and 1 passive. We're only gonna have 1 when the game releases, but the passive one has been addressed and now has an energy threshold of 150, which was down from 100, and consumes 4 energy, that was down from 8, to duplicate 25% of the damage dealt, down from 40%, which was the initial version of this passive. This will essentially, this is hard to tell if it's a nerf or a buff. It's kind of a nerf in the way that it deals damage and how much damage it deals, but the way that the mechanic will be maintained can potentially be easier because it consumes less energy, so we'll see how this plays out in the energy economy of Assassination. The active of Exsanguinate has also been addressed to consume 8 energy, down from 10, and also duplicate 70% of the damage dealt, down from 100%. Once again, these are just tuning to keep Assassination in check because the new rework is delicious. And Elaborate Planning has been removed, which, to be fair, has been one of the more boring things to maintain as Assassination. Outlaw is getting marked for death kind of nerfed because it no longer benefits from the cooldown reduction effect of Restless Blades, and the tooltip will also indicate that, kind of, confirm it for people that might have been a little bit confused. Subtlety, though, is also getting a bunch of changes. Secret Technique Shadow Clone attacks will no longer double dip from the bonuses of Deeper Daggers, Veil Touch, and Dark Brew. The Secret Technique was hitting like a truck. But Gormaw's bite damage is increased by 20%, which is great because finally the Legion ability is back now as a capstone, so having it deal more damage is very nice. While Shuriken Storm's energy cost has been increased to 45, up from 40, a little bit of an energy nerf, and Gore's Maw Bite now correctly will consume the Cold Blood buff, once again tuning a lot of fixes and issues with the rogue performing on the PTR. Demonology is getting an interesting redesign to Imp Gang Boss, and now what Imp Gang Boss does is summoning a Wild Imp has a 15 and 30% chance, because it's a 2-choice node, to summon an Imp Gang Boss instead. An Imp Gang Boss deals 50% additional damage, and imploding it will deal 50% additional damage as opposed to just summoning more imps. Now, obviously, more damage is really good. The imp refund, let's say, because imps could have been a resource in AoE, was really nice. So I don't know how I feel mechanically about this ability. It just deals more damage, and at the end of the day, it's just more damage. But having imp refunds felt really nice into the flow of Demonology of always having imps up. But it did create a situation where you felt very, very, very bad about not imploding Imp Gang Boss, which kind of you still feel the same way if they just expire. but maybe it's less of a hassle now when you just lose a little bit of damage. Well, maybe a lot of damage. We'll see how the numbers play out. And last but not least, big changes to Arms Warriors and how they interact with bleeds. I'm gonna read the dev notes real quick so that you get an idea of where these changes are coming from. Essentially saying Skull Splitter's immediate expiration of Deep Wounds and Rend caused too much rotational impact and had unintended side effects. The redesigned Deep Wounds and Rend interactions should alleviate these issues while providing Arms Warriors a new way to interact with bleed effects, which is kind of cool. Bleed effects on arms are really good, not to mention the tier set is heavy on the bleed as well. And now Skull Splitter causes Deep Wounds to bleed out more quickly for a short duration, kind of reminiscent of maybe Assassination Rogue's old Exsanguinate, so I don't know how I feel about that mechanically, but we'll see how it performs. Tide of Blood now also causes your Rend on the target to bleed out 100% faster for 10 seconds. And also a big nerf to Ignore Pain for anybody that was using Ignore Pain to kind of funnel into the anger management, rage economy, the Test of Might and all of that stuff. Now Ignore Pain will only give you the benefits of a defensive and no longer contribute to rage consumption mechanics that would buff a lot of other passives and abilities. And the bleed fantasy of arms plays very deeply into the new tier set, with the 2-piece making Rend damage increase by 30% and has a chance to trigger sudden death. And sudden death also causes your next execute to cut deeply, causing the target to bleed for 50% of the damage of the execute and trigger a thunderclap for 100% additional damage. So we're getting more and more bleed damage, and all of these bleed changes are really cool because the tier sets are actually really cool, and you can check all of the other tier sets for all the other specs and classes in the game right here, because we already have a video on it with more videos to come with all the changes for class with buffs and nerfs.